joining us today for the webinar, Diversion for Youth with Behavioral Health Needs, Applying Proven Strategies to Reduce Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Juvenile Justice System. This webinar is being offered to states participating in the initiative Improving Diversion Policies and Programs for Justice-Involved Youth with Co-Occurring Mental Health and Substance Abuse Disorders. This initiative, sponsored by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, is an effort to increase the number of youth with co-occurring mental and substance use disorders diverted out of the juvenile justice system to appropriate community-based behavioral health services and to reduce the inappropriate and unnecessary contact of these youth with the juvenile justice system. Before we begin today's presentation, we would like to review a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. We anticipate questions and have built approximately 30 minutes into this schedule for responding to questions raised by the attendees. We are using GoToWebinar technology for this presentation. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. We will do our best to answer all of your questions before the webinar is over. Finally, we will be recording this webinar and will make the recording available on the Policy Academy Action Network resource webpage. The link to the resource page was provided to core team members from each state following the Policy Academy Action Network meeting that was held on June 27th and 28th. If you have any questions, please contact the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice or me, Carly Cater, at kkeator@prainc.com. Today's webinar will provide a conceptual framework for understanding disproportionate minority contact and racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, review the Center for Children's Law and Policy's data-driven approach for reducing disparities, and learn about strategic innovations that have produced measurable disproportionate minority contact reductions in other jurisdictions. The Sampson MacArthur Foundation Policy Academy Action Network Initiative presents a unique opportunity for participating states to develop policies and programs to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in the use of diversion for youth with co-occurring mental health and substance abuse disorders in the juvenile justice system. Today's presenters are Mark Soler and Tiana Davis from the Center for Children's Law and Policy. Mark? Tiana?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. This is Tiana Davis, the DMC Policy Director with the Center for Children's Law and Policy. And we wanted to just start today by reviewing the goals, which Carly has already addressed several of them. We wanted to provide a framework for addressing DMC, or for understanding DMC and addressing DMC. We wanted to review our data-driven approach to reducing racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system. We want to review some strategic innovations that have produced measurable reductions in racial and ethnic disparities in other jurisdictions. We also want to review a case study that will give you an in-depth look at how one particular jurisdiction used data to inform DMC reduction strategies. And we also wanted to offer some practical guidance for applying the lens of race and ethnicity to your local diversion planning. So as we begin, we wanted to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, looking at the goals for reducing DMC or racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system. The first way that we look at DMC or define DMC is to reduce overrepresentation of youth of color at key decision points in the juvenile justice system. We want to reduce the disparate treatment of youth of color at key decision points in the juvenile justice system. And we want to prevent youth of color from unnecessarily entering and moving through the juvenile justice system. The slide here that you see represents overrepresentation. And as you see on the left-hand side of your screen, the overall population youth of youth of color, African American, are represented at 39%. While on the right-hand side of your screen, which represents youth transferred to adult jurisdiction, the youth of African American youth are represented at 86%. So as you see in this slide, overrepresentation occurs when a group's representation at a particular stage of juvenile justice processing exceeds their representation in the population at large. So basically, overrepresentation is a very simple statistic that reflects what many of those who work in the juvenile justice system see on a daily basis, that, as you get deeper into the system, youth of color are overrepresented. The next slide reflects disparity, and the term disparity refers to harsher treatment for youth of color than for other youth. And this data is taken from a publication called Injustice for Some. What you see here is when compared to similarly situated white youth charged with the same offenses, African American youth and Latino youth fare significantly worse than youth of other races. So, for example, for the total of these data, African American youth, there are 373 African American youth per 100,000 youth that are admitted to these state public facilities, as opposed to 59 per 100,000 youth among white youth. So in this case, youth who are African American are being admitted to public facilities at a far greater rate. And then when you break it down by offense, you see a similar trend. With violent offenses, African American youth are admitted at a rate of 137 per 100,000, as opposed to white youth at 15 per 100,000. And this third slide here represents unnecessary entry and penetration. And what we see here is the top 10 offenses of youth residing in the sample city who were admitted to secure detention from April through June of 2012. And what you see here is that a large number of youth of color, African American youth and Hispanic youth, are being admitted for lower level offenses to secure detention. So for example, youth of color, African American and Latino youth are being admitted for violations of probation, assault third, which is a minor simple assault, larceny third, minor offenses, as well as breach of peace. There are actually no white youth being admitted in this sample. So what you see is youth of color moving deeper into the system at rates that are unnecessary for reasons that do not call for secure detention. So the guiding principles for DMC reform, there are a number of those that guide the work that we do with jurisdictions across the country. The first guiding principle is to divert youth from formal system involvement and unnecessary system penetration when this is consistent with public safety. The second goal would be to structure system decision-making to decrease opportunity for bias. What we find is that often there are few structures around decision-making in the juvenile justice system, or often staff and decision makers are not held accountable to those criteria. And what happens in that case is that bias is allowed to enter into decision-making, and often to the detriment of youth of color as they move through the system. The third guiding principle is to serve youth in the community or in the least restrictive environment required to meet the youth supervision and service needs. And we want to ensure that youth of color have comparable access to opportunities for diversion as white youth. And then finally, we want to use data to inform policy, practice, and program development. Now this slide depicts diversion opportunities for youth of color, as well as for all youth. So we really view each step of each decision-making point in the system as an opportunity to divert youth of color from further system involvement. And you see at the arrest stage, there's opportunity for diversion or community service. At the referral stage, juvenile court, there's opportunity for diversion through informal processing. At detention, that we like to see opportunities for straight release or alternatives to detention, as well as at petition, diversion or dismissal, adjudication, dismissal or release, and at disposition, there's an opportunity to serve youth in the least restrictive environment, which often would be a community-based treatment or a treatment provider, or in a residential community placement.
Let me add something to that. The chart is a chart of key decision points in the juvenile justice system, starting at the beginning with arrest and then going through to referral, detention, petition, adjudication, and disposition, and also looks at who are the key decision makers at each of those points. So a key to understanding how we look at DMC is to understand that we're looking at a series of decision points, how each person who has decision-making authority in the system is making those decisions, and within the number of decisions that can be made at each point, diversion is an important option that's open to the key decision maker there.
And as we look at those key decision points and the decision makers at those points, we want to focus on what we've found or what we've learned are effective strategies for reducing disparities. And the first to highlight here is the point that effective policies and programs are data-driven. So we want to have an impact on racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system. We start with the data. And, we highlight this, the importance of this cannot be overstated. You really need to have the information, concrete data, before you can develop effective policies and programs to address disparities in your system. Locally driven with state-level support. We believe that effective efforts to reduce DMC start at the local level. The rubber meets the road in local implementation, and even in centralized juvenile justice systems that operate at the state level, many of the key decisions happen at the local level. And, there is certainly a role for the state in any case where the state would want to provide guidance and leadership and be involved in planning while supporting some of the aspects of the reform work. But we really believe that the culture of juvenile justice starts at the local level, and that's where you would want to change it as well. DMC efforts are intentional about changing the impact on youth and communities of color. We believe very firmly that there must be an intentional, articulated goal for reducing DMC. Otherwise, your system reform will not have the desired impact on youth and communities of color. Even in cases where reforms are implemented, you may see a downward trend or an improvement by and large, but when you look more deeply at the impact on youth and communities of color, you don't see the same impact necessarily. System reform has to be focused on targeted policy, practice, and program changes. Oftentimes the discourse can shift easily to discussion about youth factors, whether it's differential offense patterns, failure to comply with supervision or services, or other social factors like education or the economy. But what we found in this type of work is that neither of these approaches is incredibly helpful in reducing DMC. Instead, we like to focus on the system response. What is our system doing that is resulting in racial and ethnic disparities and the unnecessary entry and penetration of youth of color into the system? And what can we as a system do differently to keep that from occurring? We encourage folks to look at each one of these levels, what the policies are, how the practices or how policies are implemented through practice, and what programs are available or not available that may be causing youth of color to move deeper into the system and have difficulty finding a way out. So our model for reducing racial and ethnic disparities disparities is very similar to other reform models, but there are a few enhancements that we like to highlight. We want to start by engaging a broad base of stakeholders in a governing body, and that would include all of your formal juvenile justice system stakeholders, the courts, the police, the probation department, the judiciary, public defenders, state's attorneys, but we also want to engage what we call the non-traditional stakeholders in the process as well. Those would include, community members, youth and family of youth, youth and families who have been involved in the juvenile justice system, schools, other community-based organizations. And what this does is it introduces a sense of urgency to the process, number one, and it introduces different perspectives around defining DMC and what the issues are within the system, which will then lead to different perspectives on how to address those issues. What we find is that often, system stakeholders who have been deeply entrenched in the system oftentimes will see things in a very different way than folks who are bringing a new eye to the conversation and therefore informing the solution, the development of solutions in a very different way. Our first step, once we have our stakeholder body engaged, is to map the system decision points. And this is an exercise that's often, it's labor intensive in many ways, but oftentimes system stakeholders find this a very, very valuable process, because what it does is it enhances everyone's understanding of exactly how youth are moving through the system. And this may be different than what people understood to be the case. So the more you can, or the better you can understand how youth move through the system, the more you are able to gather and analyze the data in a way that really informs your understanding of how youth are moving through the system. And so you see that as the third, or the next step in the process, is gather and analyze quantitative and qualitative data. And what we find is that, the better data you have moving at the beginning, the more it's able to inform strategic interventions that will have an impact on DMC. And what you want to define initially what your issues are within the system, and then develop targeted strategies that will address those numbers and move them in a direction that shows reduced disparities for youth of color in the system. And the way that we would do that is to focus on key decision points where measurable change can occur. It's often very onerous for folks that are looking to address DMC, because there will often be a number of points of disparity in the system, and it's often difficult to target your efforts in a way that will produce measurable change. So we like to focus on one or two key points for disparity where we have clear data that can then guide what interventions we will put in place to address DMC at that stage. And then we plan interventions based on the data and then implement change. And then as the last piece of it, we want to monitor, using the data again, what's happening and whether there's been a desired impact on youth communities of color. And then if not, we want to tweak our strategic planning in order to address those issues. So as I started to discuss before, mapping system decision points, we want to understand how youth move through the system. And when we discuss policies, practices, and programs that are in place at any particular decision point, and you see the decision point outline across the bottom of your screen, we want to look at each one of these decision points and decide or understand what policies, practices, and programs are at play at each one of those decision points, so that we can have a comprehensive understanding of how youth are moving through the system. So in terms of policies, we want to look at what laws, regulations, and administrative guidelines govern decision-making at each point. And with regard to practices is how we implement those policies, who makes the decisions, when and how are decisions made, and do the decisions adhere to policy. And one of the big pieces that we also want to look at is whether or not there's accountability to the policies and how those policies are implemented by agencies and staff. And then finally, we want to look at what program options do decision makers have to provide for youth supervision and service needs. And once we have a clear understanding of how youth are moving through the system through our system mapping process, we then want to examine baseline data at key decision points, and we want to disaggregate the data by race, ethnicity, age, referral source, gender, geography, offense, and reason for referral. And using that baseline data, we can then do a diagnosis of the system of where are our biggest points of concern, or what points of concern are we best able to address at this point. And then we want to use the data to dig a little bit deeper at those particular decision points so that we can then select a subpopulation of youth for targeted reductions. So in terms of strategic innovations that have been used by several of our jurisdictions through Models for Change in the DMC Action Network, there are 4 broad categories that we like to work with. These are data practices. We use the DMC data template and performance measures, as well as language and ethnicity data collection as innovations that can support DMC reduction goals. Culture and community, which looks at community engagement and cultural and linguistic competence of staff and agencies and programs. And arrest and pre-adjudication, community and school-based arrest diversion programming, objective detention screening, and alternatives to detention. And finally, post-adjudication issues, where we address graduated responses for probation and community supervision and placement adjustment issues among youth and families. So strategic innovation data practices. The goals here are to improve the accuracy of data collection and reporting, to establish structure and process for regular use of data and system management. I mean, it's really important that using data become second nature for systems as they begin to address or look at and address DMC issues, because the data really will inform the process. It informs the strategies that you put in place, and it allows you to determine whether or not you're having the desired impact on youth and communities of color. And then we want to review regular data at each decision point in the system. So the innovations that we've seen in this area are the race and ethnicity data collection, which addresses the 2-question format. In many cases, race and ethnicity data are collected as in one question. So Latino or ethnicity is reflected in a race category in the data collection system. And what we advocate is that race and ethnicity data should be collected separately. So you ask whether what the ethnicity is, whether there's any Latino ethnicity in the child's self-identification, and then you ask whether there is race, what the race is. So then you have 2 separate categories that can then allow for disaggregation of those 2 elements of a youth identity. And language preference data collection, this is something similar where we would look at what language preference there is among youth within the system, so that system forms and other sources of information can be translated into a language that is preferred by most or many of the youth that come into the system. Then we look at the DMC data template, which allows data to be evaluated on a quarterly basis by all of the variables that I mentioned before: race, ethnicity, gender, geography, referral source, as well as offense. And then the DMC performance measures, which allow a site to examine what their efforts have been with regard to addressing DMC and what the impact of those efforts has been. Culture and community innovations. The goals of these types of innovations are to strengthen connections with communities of color and to ensure cultural competence of services. And again, this one piece of that is eliminating language barriers through translation. And with regard to community engagement, for example, Baltimore County, Maryland developed the Community and Family Resource Center to link family members with services and to encourage parents to take custody of youth referred to intake. And this had been a real issue because oftentimes youth were coming to intake and there was no extra effort made to encourage parents to come and pick their youth up, and what wound up happening is that many of those youth were detained as a result. So this program really helped to reduce the numbers of youth who were being admitted to detention due to a parent's inability or failure to come and take custody of the youth at the point of a detention decision. And in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for example, they developed a minority youth law enforcement training curriculum, which is taught to each cadet at the police academy, and it's now being replicated in several counties within Pennsylvania. And the goal here is to educate law enforcement as well as youth on what are the best ways or some of the pitfalls on how those interactions can lead to an arrest. And the goal is to reduce some of the arrests that occur when police are able to de-escalate situations with youth, and youth are better able to manage interactions that they might have or contacts that they might have with a police department in a way that does not lead to an ultimate arrest. Strategic innovations in the arrest and pre-adjudication area, the goals here are to identify alternatives to arrest, including school-based arrest, and to strengthen relationships between youth and law enforcement, again, a very important goal, and to structure decision-making for diversion in a way that allows the most possible youth to be diverted from formal system involvement when this is consistent with public safety, and to implement race-neutral criteria for diversion decisions, and to identify alternatives to pre-adjudication secure detention. And for example, in the arrest diversion area, we have, in the detention diversion area, we have a pre-adjudication coordination and transition center that was developed in Baltimore City, where it's a city where 96% of the youth entering detention are African American, and 98% of those youth served by the PAC maintained scheduled court hearings and completed the program without rearrest, which is quite an accomplishment for that jurisdiction. With regard to school-based arrest protocol, Peoria, Illinois, implemented a balanced and restorative justice program. They used peer courts and peace circles to address assault incidents at the school. And as a result of that intervention, officials saw a 43% reduction in school referrals to detention for African American youth. So there are a number of ways that jurisdictions have tackled some of these pre-adjudication issues, mostly centered around arrest as well as secure detention, and have been able to reduce some of their numbers for youth of color coming into the system and penetrating the system. And one of the big ways that we do this is through objective detention screening and developing alternatives to secure detention as well. And finally, in the post-adjudication placement and adjustment area, the goal is to serve youth in the community when consistent with public safety, and to respond both to positive and negative behaviors with graduated incentives and sanctions for youth on probation. And we want to develop alternatives to post-adjudication secure detention and placement, and then identify potential problems in youth placement, and then develop ways that would support youth success in those placements. So the graduated responses protocol and matrix, what we found is that oftentimes probation decisions on when and how to violate youth who are on probation are often a primary method for youth to be detained in after adjudication. So what we wanted to do is find a way, what these jurisdictions did was find a way that would place some structure around how youth are violated on probation and thereby hopefully reduce the numbers of youth who are entering secure detention for that reason. And this involves both enhancement of the sanctions protocol, developing graduated sanctions that would respond and measure to youth violations and give probation officers and other supervising staff a greater number of tools in dealing with youth misbehavior or noncompliance, as opposed to just going directly to a violation, which could ultimately result in youth being detained, as well as implementing a system of incentives that respond to what we know about positive youth development and gives youth some intermediate incentives for performing well and complying with the requirements of their probation. And what we found, for example, in Rock County, Wisconsin, they developed the graduated responses protocol for youth on probation, and officials there reported a 35% reduction in youth of color sanctioned to secure detention for probation violations, and the largest reductions were reported for African American youth, and their overall secure detention admissions went down by 45%. So they found this to be a highly effective strategy at reducing unnecessary secure detention admissions at large, as well as specifically for the youth of color within that jurisdiction. And I think that's where we're going to end here and break for a few questions if there are any.
Hi, Tiana. Hi. There was one question. I'm wondering if we could actually go back to slide 5.
Sure. Is that the one?
Okay. Yes. And the question was, are there any more recent data, and would the data today show the same? Would it look the same?
I can answer that. This was a particular study that was done by NCCD, National Council on Crime and Delinquency, and we have looked for people to replicate this study, but it hasn't been done. So it's, I think everyone in the field feels that if the similar study were done today, it would show something quite similar, but there hasn't been this specific study replicated more recently. It's unfortunate because we do need more up-to-date information on this.
Mm-hmm. And I think the primary purpose for including this data here was to demonstrate what the concept of disparity.
Wonderful. Let's see. And there was one other question. Would it be possible to obtain a copy of the probation violation tools that are assisted in structuring the decision-making?
Yeah, we do have a couple of samples that we would be able to provide to jurisdictions that are interested in getting more information there, absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, those are all the questions that we have at this time.
And I would just add that we have our technical assistance calls coming up, so either those individuals that are interested in those protocols can pass that information through you, Carly, or we can discuss them directly as we have our conversations with each jurisdiction.
That's a great point. Well, it's definitely something that we should make sure to address during those calls.
Okay, you're going to move on to the next slide.
Oh, we have to.
So this is Mark Soler. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Children's Law and Policy, and just a little more background about our experience and why we use the approach that we do. Our organization has been responsible for the efforts to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change Juvenile Justice Initiative, and we operated what we call the DMC Action Network, Disproportionate Minority Contact Action Network. We work with a total of 17 jurisdictions in 8 states. Some of those efforts in those 17 jurisdictions have been replicated within the states. There are actually more places using the approach now, and some of the efforts have gone statewide in a number of the states. We, based on the success in many of those jurisdictions, we are also now working in the state of Connecticut with a focus statewide with state agencies, but also in the cities of Bridgeport and Hartford, and we've already been able to help them achieve some reductions in racial and ethnic disparities in those 2 cities. We also have just started working in Arapahoe County, Colorado, and also Alachua County, Florida, to bring the same approach to help them with reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And we have been working with the Annie Casey Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative since it began 20 years ago. And as you may know, reduction of racial and ethnic disparities is one of the core strategies of JDAI. And so we have the experience of doing that too. So what we wanted to do in the second half of the presentation is to show you how all of this approach works in a particular case study, in what was done by the local governing committee in Sedgwick County, Kansas, which is Wichita, Kansas. Show you how it works and what kinds of results it got, and then move from there to applying this kind of approach to the specific issue of diversion of youth in the juvenile justice system with behavioral health needs. So in Sedgwick County, they did the basic scan and looked at arrest rates, and the thing that popped up for them was that there seemed to be very substantial disparity or over-representation of arrests for property offenses for African American youth. And you can see by the bar graph that it really stands out there, it jumps up. This kind of information does not tell us why there is this kind of phenomenon. It just tells us that there is the phenomenon, high number of arrests of African American youth for property offenses. It tells us there's something we ought to look more deeply at, and so that's good. And so we look at African American youth arrested for property offenses as a target population. And the numbers you see at the bottom of the screen are the arrest rates for white, black, and Latino youth over this time period. And you see much higher rates for African American youth during each of these 4 years. Next slide. Once the jurisdiction started looking at offenses, one of the ways we do it is look at some of the most frequent offenses. And so they looked at the top 3 arrest offenses for African American youth, the target population, and they found that theft under $1,000 seemed to be a very, very common offense, much more frequent than the number 2 and number 3 offenses. And so that told us to narrow the scope of the target population and look at African American youth who are charged with basically shoplifting or other theft offenses where the property was valued at less than $1,000. Next slide. So the people in Sedgwick looked at the relative rate index, which is the kind of information that they had to put together to report to the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And they found, as you can see there, that the rate of arrest for African American youth was much higher for property offenses than for white youth or Hispanic Latino youth. And when they computed the relative rate index, they found that African American youth were more than 4 times as likely to be arrested for property offenses as white youth. Hispanic Latino youth were 1.6 as likely, 1.6 times as likely to be arrested for property offenses as white youth. Next slide. They also looked at the gender issue, and as you probably know, we usually see about a quarter to a fifth to a sixth of the youth arrested in the system are females. So in all other offenses, what they found in Sedgwick County was that girls were 23% of the youth arrested in 2007 and 2008. But when they looked at the target population of youth arrested for theft less than $1,000, they found a very high concentration of girls in that target population. So again, this is narrowing down the target population. We're looking at African American girls, theft of $1,000, and trying to understand what the problem is, and then what kinds of strategies could reduce the number of young people brought into the system in that category. Next slide. So as we found, 54% of the sample, when they looked at the location of where the offenses occurred, they found that they occurred at 2 large malls in the county. And then only a small percentage of the arrests occurred at other locations, such as schools, private property, home, and the street. So again, we're narrowing the population, target population down. We're looking at shoplifting that occurred in these 2 large malls. Next slide. And so the people in the county tried to come up with some ideas that would reduce this shoplifting, particularly by girls, that was going on in the 2 large malls. So they came up with a number of ideas. One was some enhanced diversion policies to target youth. That is, when the kids got in trouble for their first offense, they expanded the diversion program so that there were ways of getting the attention of the young people and promoting the idea of accountability, but without formally getting them into the juvenile justice system. Then they worked on what they call the Girl Empowerment Program. This is a cognitive behavioral approach that the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has called a promising program. There's been research on the approach, and so they use that approach to work with girls who had been picked up for the shoplifting to get them to change their behavior. They also developed a community anti-shoplifting campaign, and because of the research they had done and the data they had looked at, they could target this campaign at these 2 malls, and they wanted to use peer influence as a positive influence here, and so they actually trained girls as ambassadors to go out in the mall and talk to other kids and get the word out and pass it by word of mouth, and they had flyers and other things, all aimed at reducing shoplifting in these 2 malls. Next slide. And this shows what the results were. And you can see there that from 2009 to 2010, a very substantial reduction in total juvenile arrests for theft under $1,000. And also for each of the categories of youth by race and ethnicity, there were substantial reductions. Next slide. And here we say what the reductions were. So for white youth, more than a 30% reduction in the arrests, 26% drop for African American youth, and 18% drop for Hispanic Latino youth. This all comes from collecting the data first, drilling down in the data to learn more about what the problem is and where the problem is located and what's the target population we want to aim at, and then developing strategies that focus particularly on that target population, and in this case, targeted on the location of where these offenses were occurring. Next slide. And so within this Policy Academy Action Network project, the goal, as it says there, is to increase the number of youth with behavioral health issues diverted from the system to community-based health services and reduce the disproportionate representation of youth and color. And the expected output is there. We're expecting teams to implement or enhance existing pre-adjudication diversion policies or programs with kids with behavioral health issues who are in danger of getting involved in the juvenile justice system. Not so much in the materials about how to meet the DMC reduction goal, and so there are a couple ways of doing that. Next slide. We know that youth of color are overrepresented, are underrepresented in terms of receiving behavioral health services, and are overrepresented in terms of meeting diagnostic criteria for one or more disorders. So there's no question there is an important need for something to be done in this area of diversion, and to take a close look at what kinds of services are available and what the needs are, behavioral health needs of kids of color in the juvenile justice system. Next slide. And our approach to this would be to do the same thing that we illustrated with the Sedgwick County example, that is to collect basic information on who are the kids who are going through the system, and understand some of the demographics about what's going on with them. And in order to make this focused on behavioral health needs, is to collect information on the type and level of behavioral health needs that the kids have. We have not seen research that has used our approach and collected data, and it may well be that in order to collect this kind of data, there would have to be some adjustments in the data that is regularly collected. Instead, there might need to be specific research done that might include a sample of cases that go through the system, and doing case-level reviews, looking at this kind of information in order to do the analysis, and then to come up with strategies. The kinds of things that we often see are, that we look at, is objective screening and assessment tools. Tiana talked earlier about an objective detention screening instrument that's designed to make sure that there are objective decisions made as to which kids get securely detained and which kids go into community programs and which are allowed to go home to their parents. Not basing it on the appearance of the kids or the clothes they wear or the community they come from, but based on the actual characteristics of the individual child and the behavior that they've done. And we think the same thing needs to be assured when we're talking about behavioral health issues, so we want screening instruments and assessment instruments that are race neutral. Very often, screening instruments and assessment instruments have questions or have categories that appear to be race neutral, and so they're neutral on their face, but when you look at the way the real world looks and you look at the way that they're applied, they have a disproportionate impact on kids of color. For example, a screening instrument that talks about the family may emphasize a two-parent family, and that the biological parents are the regular caregivers, but we know in many families in urban areas and in poor communities, they don't have two parents living in the home, and often the caretaker is not the biological parent, but it may be an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, or that kind of thing. And so it's important to look at these screening instruments and to make sure that potentially disparate questions are weeded out so that it's race neutral. In addition, we want to just finish the last slide. In addition, we want to make sure that there are clear and objective policies and practices and guidance for those, particularly that separate behavioral health needs from risk. In many places that we've worked, the issue of needs for services and treatment are combined or confounded with the idea of risk. Risk usually means risk of reoffending. And often people put those two things together, and we find it's more effective in terms of looking at racial and ethnic disparities to separate those out. Next slide. So we looked at the a diversion manual that was prepared by the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice and looked at the kinds of issues that come up in developing an effective diversion program. Those kinds of things include criteria for diversion to behavioral health services, requirements for youth participation meaning the rules of the diversion program. For all of these things, there should be written guidelines, and those guidelines should be objective. Again, we want to get away from making decisions based on anecdote, making decisions based on physical appearance of kids, making decisions based on where they come from, or other kinds of factors that are not directly related to the specific needs of the individual child, the assessed needs, and also to the specific individual characteristics of the child. So, as we said, we look at criteria for diversion, requirements for youth when they're in the diversion program, making sure there is equal access to services for all youth and families. And often that means equal geographical access. It often doesn't help to provide services for families who live in inner cities if the services are in the suburbs and they have to take 3 buses to get to those services. They're theoretically available, but as a practical matter, they're not so available. Another characteristic of effective diversion program is having incentives to motivate the youth and families within the diversion program. And we found that it's important to have both developmentally appropriate incentives and also culturally competent incentives. Developmentally appropriate incentives means that the incentives are geared to the development of adolescents, because adolescents look at things differently than adults do. We know that adolescents are often influenced by peers. We know that that they take risks, and the other things that all of us know about adolescents, and anyone who's been a parent of an adolescent knows about that. We want to make sure the incentives are geared to the kind of thinking that goes on in adolescent brains. We also want incentives that are culturally competent. A diversion program in largely white middle-class suburbs really should be a different kind of program than a diversion program in an inner city that is largely youth of color. There are going to be different incentives in those programs that are going to be relevant to the youth and families who are involved in the diversion program. In terms of the consequences for failure to comply with program requirements, that is, in a sense, the discipline if the kids mess up when they're in the program, we want to make sure that those consequences are equally applied. This is the issue we see that we see in the juvenile justice system generally, where we often find harsher treatments for youth of color than white youth, even when they're charged with the same types of offenses. It's similar to the issue we've seen in schools, where we find that in suspensions and expulsions from schools, youth of color often are treated much more harshly than white youth, even for the same kind of behavior. We look at a good diversion program has appropriate training for staff, and here we want to make sure there's appropriate training for staff in terms of thinking about cultural competency and developmentally appropriate programs and behaviors of youth. Program staff in a diversion program should understand what behaviors are normal for youth, like challenging authority and things like that. They may not totally comply with the rules of the diversion program, but they're normal for the kids. And staff should understand that those are normal behaviors. Staff shouldn't take them personally. They should understand kids are going to act that way. They're going to talk back to staff, and they should be able to address that to de-escalate any conflicts that occur and make sure that the goals of the diversion program are held to. Supervisory review and accountability for diversion decisions is also an important part of a successful diversion program, and we want to make sure that supervisors are equipped to know what to look for in terms of looking for racial and ethnic disparities that occur in the program. And then there's the issue about when is the diversion program over and when has the child and the family met the exit criteria. And again, those need to be objective so that we screen out criteria that may unintentionally have a disparate impact on youth and families of color. Next slide. And so here's what I call the money slide. This is the same kind of framework that you saw in the earlier slide about the decision-making points in the juvenile justice system, but this is all geared to the criteria in an effective diversion program that I just talked about. And we thought it might be helpful to think about these as questions that are asked at each of the key decision points in the diversion program, and then illustrate how for each of these key decision points we need to have objective criteria, equal access, appropriate incentives, equally applied sanctions, appropriate training on cultural competence, adolescent development, clear supervisor review, and objective criteria. Now, we are not aware of any jurisdiction that has taken a close look at all of these key decision points involving children with behavioral health needs in the juvenile justice system. Any jurisdiction that has collected the kind of data that we mentioned before, race, ethnicity, gender, geography, offense, age, source of referral, and reason for referral, but we think that that would be a great project that would add a great deal to the decision-making within the jurisdiction and would be a major contribution to the field. And within this current Policy Academy and Action Network framework, there are some resources to begin that, and we can provide some technical assistance for that. I think to do it all the way through, we would need some additional resources, but I think this would really be cutting-edge work to do, very important, and we would learn an awful lot. And so we at CCLP are very interested in any of you who are interested in pursuing this and looking at this kind of information, and so we'd be happy to talk to you about this as well as other things on the conference calls that we've been setting up over the next week or two. Next slide. And so how can technical assistance help? Well, basically in two ways. One is to look at what's going on now in terms of state or local DMC strategies. You may have some work to reduce racial and ethnic disparities going on now, and it may be that it's possible to add on a behavioral health focus to existing work that's being done in your state or in some particular jurisdictions in your state that would expand the effort in terms of behavioral health needs. The other way to do it is to start a new project to work on these issues, and as we say there, collecting the data on race, ethnicity, gender, and all the other things, collecting the data really in just a similar way that Sedgwick County did on those shoplifting arrests. Collect the data, break it down, identify the target populations, and understand if there are disparities in availability of services or if there are differences in the way consequences are applied, find out why those things are going on, develop strategies to correct the problem, and then continue to collect data to see what the impact is of the changes in the strategies. Next slide. And so Tiana and I are going to be talking to, we hope all of you, in the next week or two in terms of conference calls, and we also have some resources available to visit, I think, 2 of your sites, which we would like to do and be very interested in doing, and our only issue is it has to be done in the next 15 days because the funding is available only until that time. So at that point, Carly, can we turn it back over to you and see if there are any questions that have come up?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. We do have a few questions. I will start with the one regarding the community anti-shoplifting campaign. Mm-hmm. Were the girls who served as ambassadors previously arrested for larcenies?
Yes. For theft under 1,000, yes. Okay,
wonderful. Could you talk a little bit more about the Sedgwick County data and how the data was initially collected, in particular focusing in on, did you take into account that the police often patrol certain areas of the city?
Tiana, do you have that information?
On whether police.
Right, there's increased police presence in those areas.
Right. No, I do not have information on whether or not police presence in particular areas had an impact on the actual numbers.
That's really a good question, and we'd have to check with our colleagues in Sedgwick County. But obviously the idea was to prevent these arrests from happening, rather than getting the police involved, which would, except for the diversion program that they had for other kids, it would mean that kids would actually enter the juvenile justice system. We're trying not to have that happen.
Okay, wonderful. I think those are all of the questions that we have at the moment. If anyone has additional questions, please feel free to contact Mark and Tiana at their contact information provided on the last slide. These slides and this recording will be made available, as mentioned previously, on the Resource Center website within 48 hours, and I will send out an email to all of the core team members advising them that the slides and recording have been posted. So please feel free to contact the state team lead for additional information. If you do have questions, please contact Mark or Tiana. You can always also reach out to us at the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice. If there are, we have one other question that just came up, which we will take. Were the ambassadors also, were they specifically identified, or let's see, were the ambassadors who participated the girls people of color or Latino?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they were. And for this is a good set of questions about this program. For anyone interested in learning more about this anti-shoplifting campaign, please get in touch with Tiana, and we'll put you in direct contact with the people in Sedgwick County. Because Sedgwick County was one of the jurisdictions we worked with in the MacArthur Foundation's DMC Action Network. It's a county that has an excellent data system, and so they were able to really look at this targeted population and do the narrowing and digging deeper into the data that we talked about. They have a very good director of their juvenile justice system there who is really committed to using data-driven strategies, data-driven research, and then strategies to address these kinds of problems. And I think the best thing to do, we'll just put you in direct contact with them, and they can answer all of your questions about this program.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mark and Tiana, very much for today's presentation, and thank you all of the attendees for joining us today. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to follow up. Thank you. Bye-bye.